Um, all right, so one of the things that we've kind of covered is just the origin or the genealogy of African people, right? So one of the things that you're going to have to be able to answer are how old are African people, right? On your study guide, there's a few acceptable answers. 8 million years old, unknown, right? Because as the more research is uncovered, we find out that they get older as they go. And I'll also accept 3.2 million years old. So the three acceptable answers for how old African people are 8 million years old, 3.2 million years old, or unknown, right? Um, if you're going to use the 3.2 million years old, you should know that that is dating Lucy, right? Or Abiomi, as they call it in the African context. And that remains were found in Ethiopia. So if you're going to go with that 3.2 million years old, you want to be able to include that information to your answer as well. Also, we're going to kind of in the midterm address African individuals prior to European contact. Again, that's going back to our original class lecture. We have a couple on the list here. We have Narmer, a Kemetic pharaoh of the early dynastic period. We have Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius. Okay, no worries to see. And then we have Akhenaten, the pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Taharka, a great military strategist. Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man on the planet still to this day. Okay, so those are some individuals prior to European contact. Just familiarize yourself with those as well. So on the midterm, a question may ask, how old are African people? What is a significant individual of African descent prior to European contact? And that may be just question one for the midterm. So you want to be able to situate yourself with both of those threads of information. Now, the theoretical frameworks, these are very important. Every answer that you give must work through a theoretical framework. So again, you have 5 questions. You're only responsible for 3 of the 5 questions, but each 3 of those answers should have some theoretical framework included into your answer, okay? So our first theory is African American male theory, or AAMT, but the framework, okay? So there's a difference between the theory itself and the framework. So the framework states African people are resilient and resistant. African American male theory posits that African American people are born with an innate desire for self-determination and with a limited capacity for morality and intelligence, right? So just to put that in a few words, African people are born with an innate capacity for intelligence and brilliance, right? And they are resistant and resilient. That's just who they are. That's just part of their essence, right? And that's from the theory, African American male theory, AAMT. The second theoretical framework stems from critical race theory. The theory is critical race theory. So with so these theoretical frameworks that I'm covering, the purpose of them are to provide a working explanation on how you're making sense of the issue that you seek to tackle, okay? So if I'm gonna address the discovery of America, I'm gonna use counter storytelling as a framework to tell how the people who were on the American soil prior to Columbus had a story too. They had agency as well, right? So a theoretical framework is something that helps your readers, helps your viewers, help your audience understand and situate the theory that you're working from, and helps them understand what you're trying to argue. Wasan, does that make sense? Wasan, let me know you, okay, cool. So the first one is African American male theory. The second one is critical race theory is the theory, right? The framework is counter storytelling. Opposed to focusing on the narratives of the dominant culture, Euro-American culture, the focus is placed on telling narratives from the perspectives of those who are marginalized by dominant culture. Culturally responsive teaching models are examples of counter storytelling academic practices. Retelling with great emphasis the histories of people of color that often go ignored. So again, if we're talking about the discovery of America, we're going to tell that story in a counter storytelling context from the lens of the people who were on this continent prior to Columbus's arrival. Okay, so that's the emphasis of counter storytelling. If I could use the example of Breonna Taylor, we're not going to tell the story of the happenings of Breonna Taylor from the police standpoint. We're going to tell it from the standpoint of Breonna Taylor or her boyfriend, right? The counter narrative. Funds of knowledge. Think about Zornell Hurston, think about the reading Mules of Men, right? Funds of knowledge is the theoretical framework. This speaks to the importance of the family unit and community structure in these communities, recognizing the power in these communities, forms of knowledge, engaging in thinking that moves funds of knowledge into more historical forms of capital. So again, what knowledge is produced from the community, what knowledge is produced from the family structure, these knowledge are often ignored, right? So it's focusing on the knowledge that gets ignored, that stems from community, that stems from culture, that stems from family. Those are funds of knowledge. The last two are more like extra credit theoretical frameworks. We didn't dive in those too deep, but I do want to kind of provide you those. Fugitivity, right? We talked about this in passing. So if you think about the enslaved experience, where by definition you are someone's property, right? And you seek to liberate yourself, you seek to free yourself from enslavement. At the moment you decide to liberate yourself, you become fugitive, right? And then your desire to remain free puts you in a state of fugitivity, right? So for those who've seen the film Queen and Slim, that is a film that deals with this notion of fugitivity. For those who are familiar with the work of Harriet Tubman, right? Harriet Tubman lived her life in a fugitive mind state, right? She was constantly going back to the plantation, freeing people from the plantation and bringing them up north, right? Her travels that took her from the plantation to the north were travels of fugitivity, hiding in under the Underground Railroad, hiding in stowaway cars, things of that nature. These are all this notion of fugitivity. Maroonage. Maroonage and fugitivity are tied together, right? So if you think about how fugitivity looks like and how fugitivity works, maroonage is where you find a location, you make that location home, and you're able to maintain your freedom, right? So if you think about certain parts of Florida, certain parts of South Carolina, certain parts of Jamaica, certain parts of New Orleans, they have what are called maroon communities. And these communities are formerly enslaved people who freed themselves, set up communities in Florida, New Orleans, Jamaica, etc. And they built societies based off of their indigenous African practices, right? So this is the idea of maroonage, freeing yourself and then establishing a state of freedom or a community of freedom, right? Along with that is being able to defend that state that you established. This is the idea of maroonage. So those are our theoretical frameworks. Again, AAMT, African American Male Theory, counter storytelling, and funds of knowledge are your three ones that you'll focus on. If you want to add the fugitivity and maroonage, you could certainly do that. But I'm really looking for you guys to deal with the first three. Those we dealt with more in class, so you guys should be comfortable with those. Let's do this. Who could tell me a reading that you think spoke to the first theoretical framework, African American Male Theory? What reading you think fits within that category? So this is what we'll do. I'll jump into the readings, and then I'm gonna ask you guys what funds of knowledge you think could fit in that reading, okay? So the first reading, I didn't go over like the Ma'at reading. I didn't put the Karanga reading in there. I'm starting with the Patrice Malidoma Somé reading of Water in the Spirit, okay? So some of the questions that I want you guys to think about: the significance of the name in the African culture, but then more particularly how it pertains to the story that Malidoma Patrice Somé is telling, right? The difficulty of the English language as it pertains to translating African events. And then how does one culture shape one's understanding of what could be, what is, and what is considered to be real, right? So how does your culture determine what is reality and how you understand reality? And those are all pulled from the reading that we covered of Water and Spirit. So again, think about the importance of the name as it pertains to the reading. The difficulty of English, right? He mentions that one of the problems that he has writing the book was he couldn't write it in English because he felt a lot of things would be lost in translation, right? And then this idea of reality and what's considered real, right? He states that people's culture determines how they understand what is real and what's not real. Think about the example that he gave with Star Trek, right? And how in the West, Star Trek is fantasy, but in his culture, the things that happen in Star Trek, time travel, extraterrestrial beings, those are the reality for the Dagara culture, right? So how does your culture dictate what is your reality, okay? Is there any questions as it pertains to that? Anything you guys want me to clarify? Again, take the time to have these questions answered, because after this, it's up to you and your readings and your journal. So if you have questions, use that. Is there any questions on the Water and Spirit text?
So the Water and Spirit test, would it fall under funds of knowledge?
It could, absolutely, absolutely. What other theoretical framework do you think would fit under the Water Spirit text? There's one more that I'm thinking of that speaks more specifically to what's going on in that text.
Would it also be African theory? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that fits more concisely to the reading. And again, funds of knowledge, it does work. Absolutely, you're not wrong from that. You're absolutely right. But if you think about the innate capacity for brilliance, right? You think about the resistance and the resilience. That's all really situated within the reading and how he explains the culture of the Dagara. So it's a very good call out. Okay, so let's move on to. Actually, I'm sorry. I have a couple more things for the Water and Spirit. So this notion of primitivism and modernization, Somé problematizes this idea, right? How does he go about problematizing this idea? It's also tied to the statement I made earlier about Star Trek, right? He kind of does that problematization through his depiction and his descriptions of Star Trek. And then the final question as it pertains to a Water and the Spirit, he closes the introduction chapter articulating the idea of alienation and that modernity produces an alienation. He does provide a solution to that alienation. What is that solution, right? And if you look at the end of the reading, I think in the last paragraph, he lays that out pretty succinctly. So that's something also you should be familiar with as it pertains to this reading. Okay. Any other last questions as it pertains to Water and the Spirit? All right, so we're going to move down to Thiongo's, Ngugi wa Thiongo's Decolonizing the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature. So one, Ngugi says that there's a problem of Africa, right? What does he say is the cause of that problem? He says there's an assumed problem that everyone believes to be the problem, which is not true, but the real problem is X. What is X, right? You should know that. How does Ngugi understand the role of language as it pertains to shaping culture? So again, this is closely tied to Valadoma Somé as well. How does Ngugi views language's role in shaping culture? What becomes significant about the Conference of African Writers in the English Language? So why does he bring that up? Why is that important? What does he want us to do with this Conference of African Writers on the English Language? And then finally, according to Ngugi, what is the impetus of physical and spiritual subjugation? So he says something causes physical subjugation, something causes spiritual subjugation. What are those things? Is there any questions as it pertains to Ngugi or the reading on Ngugi or the questions that I'm posing about the reading? No? All right. So what theoretical framework do you guys feel we could place the reading for Ngugi on?
Would it be the counter narrative one?
It could. That could work, especially when he talks about the Conference for African Writers of the English Language. You could use that there more specifically, but I think there's one that also kind of fits more succinctly to what Ngugi is up to. Anyone else has a guess? Keep in mind, there's only 3, so they're gonna have to be used more than once. So if we're talking about the importance of using African languages, right? We're talking about how African language shapes African culture, right? So to me, that speaks to the African American male theory. Again, we're talking about what African people do without having the impact of subjugation or the impact of oppression placed on them, right? Who they are in their innate capacity, right? So what Ngugi's trying to get his readers and African thinkers to think about is resituating the emphasis on African culture, right? It does not make sense that we as African writers seek to write in a language that is not our own, right? So we're gonna place the emphasis back on us. We're gonna speak to our innate brilliance. We're going to speak to our capacity to be intelligent, right? To me, that's what Ngugi is up to within decolonizing the mind, right? The politics of language. From Ngugi, we have Glissant, the poetics of relation. So he starts off in the footnotes of the chapter dealing with a juxtaposition between the oral and the written, right? What is that juxtaposition? How does he articulate the difference between those two realities, right? Why is the open boat symbolic? What is Glissant provoking you to think about with the symbolism of the open boat? What does he mean with the belly of the boat being pregnant, right? What is he trying to get you to envision? What's the significance of these metaphors? The open boat, the pregnant belly, the abyss, right?
Would this one actually be the counter narrative? Because it's like from the slaves on the boat, and like he's trying to make us envision how they felt during the journey and everything.
Absolutely. That would definitely fit within the counter narrative. He also mentions the 3 metamorphoses of the abyss. Revisit that, be familiar with that. What are those 3 metamorphoses? And then what is the importance of relations? Why is Glissant so concerned and attentive with this idea of relations with the capital R, right? Also, funds of knowledge would fit into this, right? Because if you think about how he articulates Creole, and you think about how we articulate, and I use the example of gumbo, right? All the different ingredients being mixed together. Think of all those ingredients as information, as knowledge, as ways of being and ways of living, right? So funds of knowledge would also be a theoretical framework that we could situate within Glissant. Any last questions as it pertains to Glissant before we move on to the next reading? All right. So the next reading is Hurston's of Mules and Men. So one, you want to know what's the significance of folklore, right? Why is that an effective method to tell a story, right? And then what is folklore as it pertains to the African oral tradition, right? Why does that become important? How does Hurston articulate acts of subversion? So think about the bear and the lion story and the subversion that plays out there. How is the griot, this idea of the griot, right? And again, the griot is the person who is responsible for holding the stories of the African community and making sure that those stories are passed down from generation to generation. How does Hurston personify the griot in the telling of her stories, right? Think about the elders being called dad, right? That's the personification of that griot role. those were the ones who were telling the stories, right? So really the griot is personified through the elder that they call dad. And then this is, I would think this would be pretty obvious. You know, think about which theoretical framework does this text work through? What would you guys say with theoretical framework?
Would it be friends of knowledge?
Friends of knowledge, absolutely, absolutely. All right, and is there any questions about Hurston before you move on to Hurston? I'm sorry, before you move on to Baldwin. All right. So Baldwin's going to meet the man. So one, you have to know the pillars of white inferiority, right? The maintenance of white innocence, the white imagination. So you have to be able to articulate those. So be prepared with that. And then the Negro spiritual in the text, right? What is Baldwin doing with the multiple interpretations of the spiritual, right? So Jesse has one interpretation. The boy has another interpretation, and then there's the interpretation that Jesse comes to the realization of later on, right? So what does Baldwin do with that? What does the dynamics between Jesse and Otis say about raising Black children in the time, and really in the time today, right? Again, I talked about how Jesse would go to Otis to get information about race happenings, which alludes to the fact that parents who are Black have to have more detailed conversations with their children because of means of survival, to whereas white parents can afford not to have those conversations because their child's life do not depend on it, right? So those are the implicit meaning of raising Black children that you can find through the dynamics of Otis and Jesse. What's the historical significance of the picnic? How does this relate to Baldwin's story of going to meet the man? And how does epigenetics fit within Baldwin's critique of society, right? So again, epigenetics is the science of trauma being passed down through the DNA and the genes of individuals from generation to generation, right? That's through the works of Joy DeGruy Tyson, I believe. But we cannot assume that epigenetics only impacts Black people. We have to assume that they impact white folks also. As it pertains to Baldwin's narrative, right? Racism creates a psychosis also in the white folks who are perpetrating the racism, right? And this is what Baldwin is getting to. And this is where epigenetics and Baldwin's thesis begin to merge, right? Because the trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation by the victims of racism is also being passed down from generation to generation by the victimizers of racism. That's the science of epigenetics. Baldwin is being attentive to the way that this notion or these ideas of white inferiority affects the mind and the body of white people, right? So this is where the epigenetics and Baldwin's thesis coincide. So again, you only have 5 questions. What I could, I don't think you guys will have a problem answering the questions. I don't think content will be an issue. I think where you guys may lose points, if anything, will be not using a theoretical framework. Because I don't think that you would use the wrong one. It will be more so you not using the theoretical framework. And then please make sure to read your questions carefully. Just to keep it 100 with you, right? It's probably going to be 2 or 3 questions in one. So as I kind of gave you out the example for the first question, maybe how old are African people? What's a significant African individual prior to European contact, right? So what I would be looking for, right? Through a counter storytelling framework, through a African American male theory framework, African people can be traced back 8 million years old. A significant individual prior to European contact would be Mansa Musa, as he's the wealthiest man on the planet, right? This, and through the counter storytelling narrative, this information becomes important because these are things that you don't learn about in dominant societies' systems of education. Something like that would be a complete answer. You addressed both questions within the one question, you provided me a theoretical framework, and you provided an analysis on how that theoretical framework fits within your answer. Does that make sense? Yeah, no, kind of, sort of.
All right. Can you explain a little more? Like,
yeah, so if the question is just hypothetical, if the question is, how old are African people, and name a significant individual prior to European contact, right? An appropriate answer may sound like, through a theoretical framework, through a counter storytelling theoretical framework. So boom, you already laid out what your theoretical framework is, right? African people can be traced back 8 million years old, or 3.2 million years old, looking at Lucy, the remains found in Ethiopia, or unknown, because the more that they dig, the older African people get, right? So that's you answering the first part of the question through a theoretical framework. Second part of the question is, African individual prior to European contact could be Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius, the builder of the Step Pyramid. This information becomes imperative through a counter storytelling narrative, because in dominant systems of schooling, we do not learn about these happenings in these individuals. And that would be a complete answer, right? You use the theoretical framework, you answered both questions within the one question, and then you tied your theoretical framework to an analysis of how you answered the question. Does that make sense, George?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So again, so the first page realistically is going to be grouped together as one question. Okay, I'll get into that next, Cassandra. Give me 1 second, okay? Realistically, I'm probably gonna put together Some and Ngugi. That will be collapsed into one question. Glissant, he may sit by himself. He'll be a question within its own, but then I'll probably collapse Hurston and Baldwin into one question. And again, so there'll be 5 total. You only have to answer 3, but you will need to provide a theoretical framework with each answer. Now we have 5 theoretical frameworks. You're only responsible for 3, but you can use theoretical frameworks more than once, right? So if you see that funds of knowledge works for both questions, use funds of knowledge. That's perfectly fine. But just make sure you use those theoretical frameworks. That's just from my second year teaching. For everyone who's struggled with my midterm, they don't use theoretical frameworks. That's the only reason. So I'm overemphasizing that because I don't want you guys to lose points for something that's really easy. I'm gonna read off who fishbowled. If you heard your name, you know you're good. If not, you know you need to start volunteering for the fishbowl, or if I ask you, you wanna say yeah. And then we'll go over what how many journal entries we should have. And then I'll answer any question that you guys may have. I don't have this list broken up into group A and group B, so I'm just gonna read off the whole list. And you know, if you heard your name, cool. If you didn't heard your name, you need to get your bars up. So I have Cassandra, Eileen, Cecilia, Douglas, Oscar, Melissa, Diana, Chelsea, Christian, Emily, Precious, Miracle, Valeria, Cecilia, Ariane, Andrea, Wasan, George, Mariana, Valeria, Samantha, Emily, Lizette, Miyoko, Sandy, Alyssa, Jocelyn, Masrat, Ingrid, Eileen, Esperanza, Carissa, Helena, Sherilyn, Chris, George, Janelli, Jocelyn, Jemina, and Brissa. So if you have not heard your name on that list, then you know you need to get some fishbowls for the remainder of the semester, okay? Any questions about the fishbowl? All right. And so I'm gonna share my screen and then we'll go over how many journal entries you have. Give me 1 second. All right. So for journal entries, we know that Hilliard, that's 1. Kemetic Proverbs, that's 2. Karanga, that's 3. So those should be 3 entries for weeks 1 through 3. May, that's 1. And Googie's 2. Glissant is 3. So we should be at 6. We have Hurston and Baldwin. So there's 2 more. So we should have 8 total readings for your journal entry. Does that make sense? Okay. So you'll email that to me when you submit your midterm. So I'm gonna post the midterm as an assignment on Google Classroom. I'm gonna email you guys the midterm as a PDF. I'll probably send that out to you guys either Friday, probably Friday. Once I get through Thursday's group's midterm review, I'll craft it after that. I'll send the email out to you Friday. You'll have until next Wednesday. You get, it's a take home, so you have a couple of days. So just give you guys some dates. So the midterm will go out Friday, the 23rd of October. It will be due back to me the 28th of October before 10:50. So before our class starts, the time that our class would start, before 10:50, you need to have the have the midterm and your journal submitted to me either on Google Classroom or email to me. When you email to me, on the subject, put the class title, so PAS 1500-01 midterm, and then your last name, just so it helps me to situate to find the emails, because I get so many emails. I want to be able to just kind of get to you guys real quick. So if you email it to me, please put the class title, put your midterm, and put the class title, midterm, and then your last name. Yes, the 28th it will be due. So it will look like this if you're going to email it to me. So that should be the subject line. If you look in the chat, that should be your subject line if you choose to email me the midterm. So just to recap, we'll have 3 questions of the 5 answered, right? Each question should be complemented with a theoretical framework. Mind you, in one question, there'll be like 2 to 3 questions in one, so make sure you answer each subset of the question. You'll submit 8 journal entries. And if you have the option of, you'll submit it to me by the October 28th before 10:50 a.m. So October 28th before 10:50 a.m. If you're emailing it to me, you'll put the subject line as I put in the chat. If you're submitting it through Google Classroom, it will be submitted under your name, so you'll know it's been submitted. Also, as soon as I get through grading all of the courses midterms, I'll post those grades on Google Classroom, so that way you'll know what your grades will be and where you stand in the class. Keep in mind, what we'll also do is start pairing you guys up into groups. So when we meet again next week, we'll pair you guys up into groups, so that way you can just start meeting as a group to start working on your group projects for the final project of the semester. So if you think about it, you're turning in your midterms, you're turning in your journals. After that, all you have to do is turn in the final project and the final journal, then you're done for the semester. So start thinking about, the projects, and start thinking about, well, once you get your groups, exchange contact information, start meeting about those projects, so that way you guys won't be rushing to get those in at the last minute. Let me see, one second. And not to overwhelm you guys, but I just want to put that on your radar. I'm sorry, someone had a question? Go ahead, Christopher. Oh, where did I get my shirt? It's a website called RBG Tees. Yeah, I think it's on Instagram, RBG. So RBG for red, black, and green. Tees, Teez. I'm gonna share my screen one more time, show you guys the syllabus, just to kind of get your mind thinking about the final project. Again, it's not really a rush, but just to kind of get you guys thinking about it in the groups. Can you see this? So these, and I'll probably add about 2 to 3 more songs on here, but you'll choose a song, and then based on who chooses what song will determine what group we're in. And then you're gonna put together an oral presentation on the song. So that's what we'll be looking at for the final project. Again, you just choose whatever song speaks to you. And then based on who chooses that song also will determine who's in your group. You guys will set some time outside of class, converse, come up with an oral presentation that will involve each member of the group. And then on the last week of class, we'll all present our projects. All right. So that's the final, that'll be the final thing. Let me see. Chelsea, let me see, the first 2 are together. Let's count it one more time, Chelsea. I believe it's 8, but just to be sure. All right. Share together. So the first readings. So Hilliard. Did we put those together, Chelsea? I put the Comedic Proverbs with. I think you're right. I think she's right. So 1, 2. Okay, she's right. So it should be 7. So these 3 were all lumped together. So the Comedic Proverbs, Teachers of Patahotep, those are all provided as 1 reading. Okay. And then the Karangas were provided as, so that should be 2. So she's right. We should only have 2 readings. Or sorry, 7 journal entries, excuse me. All right. Is there any other questions you guys have? Please take advantage of this time because,
I have a question about the 5 questions.
Okay.
So like if we, even though we're only like supposed to do 3 like minimum, say we do like really bad on like one of the questions and we do all 5, would it just be counted that we did 3? I mean, that we did 4 if we do really bad on one?
I could take that. Just to me, like, why do more work, right? Like, if you just answer a theoretical framework, if you answer every part of the question, you should be fine. And that's really why I'm overemphasizing that. If you don't do those things, that's the only way that you're gonna fuck the question up, just to be honest with you. I mean, if you engage in the reading, if you know some things about the reading, the only way that you'll mess up is not having a theoretical framework or not answering the question completely. So I'm confident in your ability to answer the question and get it right. That's why I'm just overemphasizing the theoretical frameworks and reading the whole question. But I mean, if you want to do that extra, I will take that into consideration and I will grade accordingly. But I just don't want you guys having to do more work than what's necessary. That's why I'm only assigning 3 of the 5 questions, Any other questions? Does anybody want to cover in more detail any of the material or the questions that I posed in the study guide? Yes, the midterm will be short essay, yes. Okay, so everybody feels confident in their ability to kind of track down these answers that are in the midterm review questions? All right. So if you guys have no questions, we're good for today. If not, you could always email me and we could set up a Zoom. But I would definitely take some time, go through these questions that are posed in each reading and try to look in the text for the answer. If you could do that, you'll get an A on your midterm. Long as you use those theoretical frameworks and as long as you answer the question completely, you should be fine. Yeah, I'll post the recording. I like to keep it fair, so I'll probably post the recording on Friday because at the other class, they don't get to go to class till Thursday. So I'll post both recordings on Friday so that way you guys have those available. But with that being said, also engage previous recordings, right? If you don't want to go through the text and look through the text, you could watch what's been recorded and you could also get those answers through our conversations. But I think it would be easier just to kind of skim through the text looking for those answers and you have your whole midterm filled out, your midterm study guide filled out. Any other questions?
If you can give us like one piece of advice, what would you say that we would focus on more, like the theories? To just give us that tip.
Just don't. My advice would be just to don't forget the theories, right? Like because I don't want it to be where you're focusing more on the theories and not answering the question, right? But just in my experiences, I've had a lot of students just forget to use the theory. They'll answer the question in its entirety, and they're absolutely right, but they just don't add a theoretical framework, so I have to dock them a point. So I don't want to say overemphasize the theory, but my advice would be don't forget him. So that's what I find happens more than anything. And then also, like if I'm giving it to you on Friday, don't wait till Tuesday to answer that motherfucker, right? Like give yourself some time to go through and research. It's a take-home test, right? So use your sources, use your journal, use the text itself, but give yourself time to be able to kind of finger through and find something if you need to find it. Because if you rush and you do it in the last minute, you're going to do yourself a disservice. So my advice to you is don't forget the theoretical frameworks. Give yourself enough time to where you're not stressed about it, and you should be fine. I'm not trying to make it too difficult for you guys. Any other?
Yeah. Okay, so is the question like because how you said that we have to answer like 3 out of 5?
Mm-hmm.
Will there be like different parts to the question, or will it just be like 3 straightforward like questions we will have to answer?
Say that one more. So I'm going to restate it to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. Yes, there'll be 5 questions. You only have to answer 3 of those 5 questions, but within one question, there may be 3 questions in one. So for example, question 1 may be, how does Baldwin's articulation of the pillars of white supremacy intersect with Hurston's ideas of subversions and the telling of the story of the bear and the lion, right? So one, within me asking that question, you have to be able to articulate Baldwin's understanding of the pillars of white supremacy, right? So that has to be addressed in your answer. And then 2, you would have to articulate how Zornell Hurston talks about subversion through the tellings of the bear and the lion, right? So those are 2 things that you would have to speak on in your essay. And then 3, you would have to connect those 2 and use a theoretical framework to help explain your answer. So that's what I mean by saying there's like 3 answers in one. Does that make a little more sense, Cecilia?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I thought it was gonna be like question 1, part A, part B, part C, kind of thing.
It's not that cut and dry. Like I want you to kind of. That's what I'm saying. Like read that shit carefully, so you're making to understand what you're reading, what I'm asking you, right? Like this is also a practice of making you an attentive reader. Like this is why it's set up in the way that it is to make you be able to look for movements in reading, right? So read carefully and give yourself time to do so. I'm not going to lay it out like question 1A, question 1B, question 1C. The questions will be embedded into one sentence question or one paragraph question. If you guys want, I could pull up an old midterm from a previous semester to kind of see what I mean by the questions being built into the question. All right, give me 1 second. Okay. So for example, like question 1, there we have it. How old are African people? There are 3 acceptable answers. You must also name an African individual prior to European contact and the significant contributions of this individual. In this essay, you should include why this information is important in the world of academia or in your personal experience or development. So like, that's probably going to be your first question, just to keep it 100 with y'all. Like, I don't like to make shit harder than it is. So you're looking at question 1 of your midterm right there, right? So again, as you can see from this question, really it's like 4 questions embedded into that one question. So question 1, how old are African people? That's your first question, right? Name an African individual prior to European contact. That's your second question. The significant contributions. That's your third question, right? Include why this information is important in the world of academia or your personal experience. So that's your 4 questions embedded into question 1, right? So to get the full points, you would have to address each 4 points of those questions and then also use a theoretical framework to help explain your answer. How has the telling of American discovery problematized American race relations? How does the work of Ivan Van Sertima seek to address this quandary? In your essay, you must state Van Sertima's thesis and how he lays out his arguments. Examples will be useful, right? So again, even in question 2, we have maybe 3 questions built in this. So how has the way that we've been told the discovery of America cause issue for race relations? So that's one question, right? How does Ivan Van Sertima's work address that issue? That's 2 questions. And then what is Van Sertima's thesis? That's 3 questions. So again, even in question 2, there's 3 questions embedded into that question, and you need to use a theoretical framework to explain that question. So does that help make it a little more sense for you guys?
Yes, more for me.
Okay. So that's kind of like what you will be looking at. Let me see. How long should the answers be? As long as it takes for you to answer them, Ariane. Like I'm not really one who or it has to be 5-page sentences. I don't care. Like if you could answer the question in 1 sentence and do all of what's required, then shit, you did it, right? Like I'm not going to say it needs to be longer, but just make sure you answer every part of the question and make sure that you use a theoretical framework. I have seen students who have done all of that in 1 sentence and they've gotten full credit, right? I've seen students who each part of the question is a damn near a paragraph itself, right? And they've gotten full credit. So long as you have the question answered in totality, and as long as you're using a theoretical framework, I'm good to go. Any other questions? Question for you guys. After going through the midterm review, how do you feel about the midterm? So, Cassandra said I'm all right. So. Anybody else? Pretty confident. Chris, cool.
Yeah, I feel pretty prepared.
Okay. Trust me, I'm not here to make this shit hard for y'all, right? I'm not gonna just give out grades either, but I'm not looking to fail anybody. If you engaged in conversation, if you've been critically engaged in your material, you'll be fine. Yeah, so I'm not too worried about you guys. Just from the conversation that I've had in this course with you, you should be all right. But if not, if anything comes up, always feel free to shoot me an email. We'll set some time if we need to do another Zoom. I can do that too. Just let me know. Other than that, we are good to go. I'll hang out if anybody has any personal questions.
And thank you, Professor.
Oh, you're welcome. You guys have a good one.
Thank you.
you. Have a good day.
You as well.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So you know how you said that for one question, there's going to be multiple questions within that question, right?
Yes.
Does it have to use each question the same theoretical framework?
No. No, not necessarily. So you could use multiple theoretical frameworks into the question if you like, right? How you choose to construct your question is totally up to you. As long as I see at least one theoretical framework used, then I'm okay with that.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Esperanza, Wasan, you guys have questions? Chris?
One question.
Yeah.
For the journals, just to make sure that I've been doing them right, it's supposed to be the 3 paragraphs where you, one is like to summarize, one is to connect it to you, and like one is your interpretation, correct?
So the first paragraph would be the thesis. So what is the author's thesis, right? What are they arguing, or what are they trying to get you to understand? And then within that paragraph, you're going to address the method. How do they get you to understand what they want you to understand? So that's your first paragraph. Your second paragraph is your analysis. So how did you make this readings make sense for you, right? Did you think about other readings you read in the past? Did you think about a movie you saw? Or did you think about a personal experience that you had? How did you make what you read make sense for you? That's your second paragraph. And then your final paragraph is, how does the readings relate to what's going on in the world today? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. And then Chris, did you have a question? Yeah, so, gotcha. Give me 1 second, Chris. There you go. Okay, so Wasan, you have a question about the theoretical frameworks and using the theoretical frameworks to answer the questions, correct? So let me do this. I'm gonna put my screen back on. We'll share the screen. We'll go through this question here. Let's see. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to answer a question with a theoretical framework, so bear with me. Okay. Okay, so look at question 4, Wasan. So question 4 states, what is the significance of Harriet Tubman's work for the advancement of the intersectional activism? What 2 theoretical frameworks most strongly characterize the work she dedicated her life to, and why? Finally, why hasn't Tubman been revered in history when compared to the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders? Okay, so Wasan, are you at all familiar with Harriet Tubman and what she's done? Wasan, you with me? Okay. Harriet Tubman was a what you call an abolitionist. She was one of the architects of the Underground Railroad, right? So what she would do is take enslaved Africans from the plantation and take them on underground routes and detours up north to Canada, right? So if you think about what that work does, think about how I articulated the theoretical framework of fugitivity and maroonage, right? So that question directly replies to the theoretical framework, fugitivity and maroonage, right? So what is the significance of Tubman's work for intersectional activism? Intersectional activism is the fact that she's a woman, right? And she's a Black woman. So she's oppressed because she's a woman, and she's also oppressed because she's Black. So her work advances intersectional activism because she shows that women have the ability to be emancipators, to be liberators, right? And it shows the agency of Black people as it pertains to advocating for their freedom, right? So that's how I would answer the first part of that question. The 2 theoretical frameworks that most strongly characterize the work of Tubman are fugitivity and maroonage. Tubman's life was the personification of fugitivity, as not only did she steal herself from the plantation, she returned over 16 times and freed other enslaved Africans from the plantation system, right? Not only was her work fugitive because she freed those people, it was also maroonage because she set them up in places where they were able to maintain and sustain their freedom. So the two frameworks that most succinctly characterize the work of Tubman would be maroonage and fugitivity. And then to answer the last part of the question, I would argue that patriarchy is why Harriet Tubman is not celebrated like the works of Dr. Martin Luther King, etc. Is due to the oppression of women as historical figures, right? So that's how you would use the theoretical frameworks to answer those questions. Does that make sense for you, Wasan? If not, I could do one more. Okay. Okay, and then Esperanza, did you have a question also?
Oh, one last quick question.
Sure.
For the midterm, is there a certain like format that you want us to do it in? Because I know like some teachers want like a cover page or like double.
No, just give me at least 1.5 spacing on the font. You can do double, but just do at least 1.5. Just helps me read it a little bit better. You know, I'm not tripping about a cover page or nothing like that. I'm just really looking for you to answer the questions and use the theoretical framework.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You're
That's
welcome.
it.
You're welcome.